So thank you, Senator, for coming.
Thanks, Bill.
And I want to start off with what seems to be one of the main themes in not only this race, it has been in our state races as well, which is income inequality. To what extent do you think the government has a responsibility to deal with that?
I look at it this way. This is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. That's a good thing. I believe in entrepreneurship. I was in the private sector for 14 years, and I believe in capitalism. But I also think that the government has the really an obligation to step in as a check and balance on things sometimes. Sometimes that's about consumer safety, or sometimes that's for things like national defense. And then sometimes that's for things like making sure that people can pursue happiness, which is what our founding fathers said. And to me, the way you do that is by giving them opportunity. And that's how I think about it, that people should have this right to opportunity. That doesn't mean everyone's going to be the same or they're going to have the same amount of money. But you want to make sure that there is opportunity, and that if things go really wrong, and it can happen to anyone, that there's a safety net. That's why we have Social Security. That's why we have Medicare. That's why we have Medicaid. And that's why I'm such a strong believer in keeping those programs strong. But at the same time, you want to be able to have people participate in the economy. And I think a best example of that for me with a policy is my education policy. You know, I believe strongly in K through 12 public school. My mom taught second grade till she was 70. I went to the public schools, and we've got to make sure they're strong. But we also have to make sure that when people graduate, that they're able to be contributing members of our economy if they can, unless they have a disability or something like that, and then they need help. So I am not for free college for all. We'll start with that, for instance, because I don't think you should be spending government money to send rich kids to college. But what I do think we can do is to provide opportunities so that everyone can succeed. I live this. My dad, my grandpa worked 1,500 feet underground in the mines his whole life. He wanted to be in the Navy, but he had to help his 9 brothers and sisters. And with my grandma raised my dad and his brother. He saved coffee can in a basement to money in a coffee can in the basement to send my dad to a 2-year community college, and then to the University of Minnesota. Donald Trump, okay, he was lucky. He got $413 million in his career. You couldn't fit that in the coffee can. But I figure if people give you opportunity, then you should have not a sense of entitlement, but a sense of obligation to help others. And so for me, that means my dad got that. So let's make sure that other people have these opportunities. Smartest way to do it, there's a community college here, 1- and 2-year degrees free. Why? Those are the fastest growing jobs. For 4-year degrees, I would double the Pell Grants, and I would double the income level that you can get the Pell Grants at, from $50,000 to $100,000, from $6,000 total grant money to $12,000. That way you have money going to the people that need it the most. And to think big, you have to connect what's happening in our education system to our economy. We're not going to have openings for MBAs, really. We're going to have openings for plumbers. We're going to have over 1 million openings for home health care workers and over 70,000 openings for electricians. So when I look at income inequality, I say, well, how are we going to help those people who want to be home health care workers that we want to be home health care workers? I would not put the money to free college. I would make it easier for people to go to college. I would put that money toward universal child care and helping the third of the workers that don't have any retirement to have retirement in a gig economy. I would have work family leave and those kinds of things, that you can make sure that the people who take those jobs that we want them to take, increase in a minimum wage, that don't pay as well, are able to do those jobs. It's better for our whole economy. So I just look at it as a series of decisions that reflect our values that help people to gain opportunity.
Okay, so when you talk about putting that money toward child care and 2-year degrees, what money?
Sure.
how much money and where's it coming from?
Right. I know I'm in New Hampshire, a very fiscally conscious state, as is mine, and I think that's actually going to be a major issue in the general election because we have a president that's been treating the people of this country like poker chips in one of his bankrupt casinos. And that tax bill that he did added over $1 trillion in debt. And when he finished up with that bill, he went down to Mar-a-Lago and he said to his friends, and I can tell you there was no one from Keene in that room, he said to him, Aya, you just got a lot richer. So instead of doing that, I think we should roll back a lot of the most regressive parts, not all of it, of that tax bill and use some of that money for infrastructure, which is a big need here. I'd use $400 billion of it. That's 4 points on the corporate tax rate. And then I would use another 2 points of it to start a deficit payment fund. And that would be $200 billion right there. Add another $1 billion from spending that you could get. I would have every cabinet head come up with ideas and get to $1 billion and start going on the debt. I think everyone expects a presidential candidate, after we've had this guy in the White House, I think that the difference between a plan and a pipe dream is if you show how you're going to pay for things. So I could literally show you how I'm going to pay for everything I say today. It might get a little boring, but I will. And I have an entire list of it. And they're not pipe dream ideas. They're not pie in the sky things. They're things like rolling back the oil giveaways. That gives $30 billion right there. The hedge fund loophole, $18 billion. That's what that's calculated at right now. Taking the capital gains rate and at least putting some of it back to the personal income rate. And you could have some allowance for long-term investments. That brings in a conservative estimate, hundreds of billions of dollars. Immigration reform, something that Grover Norquist had as his top priority in 2013. I called him as a friendly witness. It was supported by the AFL-CIO and the Chamber. It was supported by the migrant groups and the Farm Bureau. And that brought in $158 billion CBO score in 10 years. Going to Jean Shaheen's form of budgeting, which is every 2 years. I mean, think of how crazy it is right now. Every year we do a new budget. Sometimes we just extend the old budget because we can't get on agreements. There is never a year to go back and look at what we did in the first year to figure out, is the money being spent? Is it being spent well? Can we take things from one area of the budget and move them over? That's a bipartisan bill she has as president. I would get it done. It's your neighbor, Angus King, who's a good friend, who said it took us decades to get into this woods. I like this New Hampshire and Maine analogy. It's going to take us decades to get out. So we can't do this on the backs of the people who already can't afford childcare, that's for sure. But we can chip away at this debt, and the least we should do is show how we're going to pay for things.
Just real quick on that, this only got a couple seconds of the debate, but you had an exchange with Senator
I thought you were going
Warren.
to say we're talking about the room when I did a long thing on the debt in the room, but it got pretty. It was okay today.
No.
Okay,
Not
yes.
today,
We had a thing with Warren was
so
yes.
it was on the wealth tax, and so she and Senator Sanders, and we had Bernie in the other day. I mean, they argue that it's a wealth tax is such an effective way to bring in a ton of revenue to address any kind of social programs and the debt and deficit. But you. And again, this is in a soundbite form, so if you could elaborate on why
Sure.
you think that going after these unrealized assets that are just sitting around is unrealistic or not the best way to cover these kind of expenses you're
Yeah,
talking
well,
about.
I am open to that. I think we should look at it. I have not used it. It doesn't mean I'm not open for it. It'd be a great way to pay off the debt, by the way. I have not used it for one of these pay-fors for education funding or for things like child care or infrastructure, simply because I think we have a lot of differentiation. Forbes did a study on how much it would bring in and what it is. My things are much more concrete, and they are things that have been talked about before. I say one innovative pay-for I have is for the long-term care, which is to take trust funds for kids over $500,000 that wealthier people set up, and tax the appreciation on that, the gains on that. That would bring over $100 billion. I got the idea from a rich guy in Boston. It was pretty good. And so that would pay for long-term care. And my plan there, which we're not dealing with at all, is long-term care and the doubling of our senior population. And so I am open to that. I've just used more concrete pay
Yeah.
for the rest of my
Gotcha.
work.
So we'll go to healthcare now. And you talked about having expansions for Medicare and Medicaid, and you're basically in the public option, but not elimination of private insurance camp. First of all, if you could just kind of explain, your understanding of the difference between the two and why you think yours is better. But we also had, when Senator Sanders was here, he said that to the people who argue Medicare for all would be great, ideal system, but it's unrealistic with Congress. He said that he could pass it through budget reconciliation, and since you're his colleague in the U.S. Senate, I was wondering if you have thoughts on whether that is feasible.
Yeah, I actually said at the last debate that to him that his fight wasn't with me. It was for a bunch of the new members of Congress that got elected. Democrats who don't agree with him on this,
Yeah.
and it is not with me, it's with the new governor of Kentucky and a lot of other people that see it this way. There is a way to do this, and it's called the Affordable Care Act, which was a beginning and not an end. It is now 10 points more popular than the President of the United States, and I don't think we should be blowing it up. And so what I would do is start with that, and I would bring in, as you point out, a nonprofit public option. My issue with Medicare for All is that it says on page 8 that in 4 years from now, 143 million people would lose their current health insurance. It is very clear, and there's a whole bunch of people that don't want to do that, including in our own party. So the nonprofit public option, you could do it through Medicaid or Medicare. Immediately, 12 million people would be eligible for health care that aren't. 13 million people, according to one study, would see their premiums go down. I would go from there to do things like take on pharmaceutical prices. Jeannie has done a lot of work on reinsurance, cost sharing. That's something you could actually get done. That's bipartisan right now, immediately, and it would be very helpful for some states that aren't doing it. I think there are a whole bunch of things we can do. Even stopping the sabotage of the Affordable Care Act from this administration would bring in an estimated 2 million more people coverage.
And speaking of that, would you roll back some of the evisceration of the act that has gone on? I mean, would you
Right,
bring back the individual mandate,
Yes.
for instance?
Yes, I think that's what you should do. I think it makes the whole thing work better, much better. And then I also would obviously stop the lawsuits that are going on from the Justice Department's perspective, at least. And then I would expand on it with things your newspaper has focused on a lot, which is addiction and mental health care, which there's been some work on that, but not enough. Enforcing mental health parity when it comes to insurance policies. And then also doing more when it comes to treatment and suicide prevention. I was explaining today how for me this comes from my heart. My dad struggled with addiction his whole life. And finally, when he faced his third DWI sentence, he had to choose between jail and treatment. And he chose treatment. And in his words, he was pursued by grace. And it changed his life. And he now is 91 in assisted living, and his AA group still visits him. And in his words, it's hard to get a drink around here anyway. But so I think making sure that we're focused on the things that are really plaguing people in their everyday lives, which is mental health, opioid epidemic, those things, doing something about long-term care, which is the elephant in the room, and certainly taking on pharmaceuticals. I have led that effort since I got to the Senate. We weren't able to do anything with that in the Affordable Care Act. That was a big mistake. Nearly 20% of healthcare costs, when you include hospital pharmaceuticals, is pharmaceuticals. And there's been nothing. There's ban on negotiation under Medicare, less expensive drugs from other countries. I'm sure Bernie brought that up. That was our amendment we did together. And at midnight, some night, Klobuchar Sanders, we got 14 Republican votes. I now have the bill with Grassley to actually make that a reality. So I actually think these are huge opportunities for cost savings for consumers and the government.
And we're going to get to actually mental health and opioid addiction in a second, but you just made me think of, there was a, to your point about kind of keeping a coexistence with private and public health care. So it was from the Milliman Research Institute, and basically this was like a 2-year study that they commissioned back in 2017 that showed from like 37 million private insurance folks who were looking for mental health care, and this report concluded that in general in the United States we've reached a point where it's actually easier to access mental health care if either you're able to get Medicaid or Medicare, or you are going to someone who, for example, is a psychiatrist or a therapist who doesn't take any insurance
Right.
and will just go out of pocket. And mental health parity ostensibly is around, but on that kind of ground level, that's not the case. So could you talk about how your plan would try to get actual mental health parity with
Sure.
having that care level out?
Well, it is the enforcement of the law. The law passed. The mental health parity bill was actually part of TARP, weirdly, and I voted for it. Yes. And Paul Wellstone, who is the former Minnesota senator who died in the plane crash, had worked on that with Ted Kennedy and Patrick and others. And then what's happened since then is we've been trying to get it implemented. And as president, I would take that on in a big way. I actually got the bill passed on eating disorder, getting the insurance companies to cover that with former Senator Kelly Ayotte from here and Shelley Capito and Tammy Baldwin, and I led that bill, and that actually has been successful in getting that done. So I think you can do more and more with enforcing mental health parity. And the other piece of this is just pure money for funding. You don't have enough mental health beds in New Hampshire. I would take the opioid money, that settlement, which is going to be huge, just conservative estimate, $40 billion, and use that along with some other funding sources
Yeah,
to
that's
help
the
pay
Sackler
for.
family one. Is that?
Well, there's going to be a global settlement, just like there was with tobacco. But when I'm president, I would actually want to have a federal global settlement, which you can
Okay.
do. And then you make sure the money is going to the right places, like states that really need it, which we worked on with Jeannie and Maggie on the way the opioid funding went out already to make sure that states like New Hampshire got the funding that they deserved. And so what you do here is you have this federal global settlement, and you could include other forms of addiction in it, and you could include mental health. So the way I was the first one to come out with a mental health plan, and it's funded by $40 billion from the master settlement, $40 billion from a 2 cents per milligram tax on opioids, and then the rest from different financial fees and other things.
So one of the big players in mental health assistance is Medicaid, which the federal government puts in its share, and then states put in their share, but not all equally. Is that a broken system in that way, or
Well,
is that okay, and each
no,
state can
I just-
decide that?
I think that we should up our funding for mental health care, period. And then you could do more incentives for states to give more. But that is another way you do the funding. The other thing we need to do is lift the, there's a waiver limit on how many mental health beds that you can have. You have to apply for a waiver at 16. And you can't get Medicare funding over Medicaid funding over 16, and so I would change it to let them get funding, and that would make a big difference. You can't get the funding if you have more than 16 beds.
Is that a CMS waiver?
Yes.
Okay.
And so right now you have to apply for a waiver, but I would make it permanent.
Okay. And the other thing I want to ask about mental health, and you touched on the opioid crisis, that and what seems to be a somewhat drastic rise in suicides
30% increase in 15 years.
would seem to have some kind of underlying cause. What do you think that is, and what would a president do to deal with it?
I think there's a lot of causes. Part of it is technology, and people are feeling more and more isolated, and they're looking at their phones instead of looking at each other. That is going to take a whole society's look at how we're handling each other with technology.
So social capital, kind of?
It's that. It's acknowledging that this is happening, that people are distracted all the time in addition to feeling isolated, and they're not listening to each other. The second thing is availability of counselors in schools schools. I was in one rural school, not in New Hampshire, and the counselor said that she had in a school of 650 kids, 4 kids come up to her, visit her that day with thoughts of suicide. They were all 4 immigrant kids, and they were afraid their parents were going to be deported. They worked at a plant. And so that is, again, some of the mean-spirited policies of this administration and some of the rhetoric you hear out there and the hate, plus the fact that there's not enough counselors and help for people. And especially in rural areas, people feel very isolated. And then you have that where you see the suicides more or increases, bigger increases, rural, students, LGBTQ, veterans, right in parking lots. And again, it's our whole society and how we're treating each other. And there's no way anyone can look at this and say the remedy is Donald Trump.
Well, what is it?
The remedy is a president that's going to, one, acknowledge this so that there isn't so much stigma, like I do when I talk about my dad when it comes to addiction. Having someone that brings people together more and is concrete at looking at solutions with federal, state, and local government. It is looking at things that sort of rear into this whole thing, like hate and hate crimes, and don't affect all of this. It's not about all of it, but it's part of it. And getting enough medical professionals, and that's things like incentivizing people to go into areas where we need help, like medical at all different levels, nursing assistants on to doctors, immigration reform. Right now I lead that bill, and as president I could get it done like that, which is the Conrad 30, named after Kent Conrad, because rural areas couldn't get enough doctors. And it says that when a medical student from another country gets their degree in the U.S., that they don't have to go back to the other country to do their residency. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. They got a degree at a medical school in the U.S. We want them to stay here, but we're sending them back. And so what the Conrad 30 bill does, it takes each state, and I've been leading the reauthorization, and we just got it done, actually, last week. But it allows for more the doctors to stay, the residents to stay. Now, I would expand it greatly, and I would do a path to citizenship and those kinds of things. So it's a combination of training. And when I went to a VA, the head of psychiatry there said that the number one thing he wanted was that, because he wanted more of the medical students that study from abroad. So these are all things that we have available to us right now, and we just have to start thinking of things in how it makes our economy work better and how it makes our country work better, instead of what these partisan and geographic divides are. And I am a master of that. That's what I do. I passed over 100 bills where I am the lead Democrat. I have, when I announced my candidacy, there was an article in one of the Hill newspapers quoting 5, 6, 7 Republican senators that have worked with me positively. I don't know if it'll help me in the primary here, but the point is that I believe we need someone heading this ticket that actually sees that you stand your ground, but you also find common ground, and that courage isn't just standing by yourself hurling insults. That courage is, can you stand next to someone that you don't always agree with for the betterment of this country?
So, and kind of along those lines, you make a point of saying on the trail a lot that based on, the kind of way we become almost geographically polarized, but also culturally polarized, we're not often having the same conversations in this country. And as the 2010s come to a close, I think a lot of Americans thought that when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, that we were either already in a post-racial society, and then for people who doubted that even, they may have said, we're making a lot of progress. And as the decade closes, and I think as a lot of Democrats saw President Trump run very much a cultural campaign against Hillary Clinton in 2016, and he was, rose to prominence in the GOP as a birther, that I think people think race relations, and there's polling to show this, that people believe it's worse now than it was at the outset of the Obama presidency. What kind of policies do you think we could implement to, try to have a better sense of fairness? I know reparations have come up in the campaign, but also just in terms of how we talk with each other? What things do you think you could do with a bully pulpit as president to
Right.
improve that?
Well, the first we've already talked about economic opportunity to address specifically income inequality, areas that have been historically impoverished. African Americans who, we know there's institutional racism when an African American woman goes into a maternity room, says her hands are swollen, the doctors don't listen to her, and she loses her baby. That happened in New Orleans, and we see that kind of mortality rate increase for African Americans across our country. Or a vice president at a company who's African American in my state goes into a store, is walking around, gets trailed by store security the entire time. We know that there's racism in the criminal justice system, or the fact that African Americans women make and men make so much less than white Americans. So to me the answer is all these policies we talked about from the very beginning with educational opportunity and making sure that it is targeted. But it is also about the very right to vote. And I lead those bills to stop racist policies when it comes to voting. Reauthorizing the Voting Rights Acts, and the bills that I do lead are things like registering every kid to vote when they turn 18 instead of allowing states, and that would be nationally. And you can do it. We all get a social security number, and you know who's eligible and who's not. So why don't you just give them a registration card when they turn 18? Having independent commissions like you have here for figuring out the makeup of districts, we can do that. Getting rid of Citizens United with a constitutional amendment. All of these things would mean that African Americans and people of color would be more fairly represented. There was a court out in North Carolina that actually issued an opinion that said that the North Carolina legislature was discriminating with surgical precision. And that was a Republican-appointed judge that said that. That's what we've seen in the country. So how are they going to get fairness if they can't even vote?
Yeah. I hesitate to even say the other side, but if you look at events like Charlottesville, these are not, I think a lot of people always say, well, the younger generation is so much more open-minded on race, but these were younger, white guys who were doing this. And you look at the messaging coming out of, let's say, someone like Stephen Miller in the White House, where they use terms like reverse racism, that the Democrats have gone too far, and that, the way that certain members of Congress are targeted as being, whatever term you want to use, too politically correct or whatever. And that comes to maybe some of these Obama-Trump voters that the party wants to, and I assume you would like to win over in the race.
I have.
How do you, what do you hear from them back home, and how do you get them to come back to the Democratic Party when they may think that they're not in line culturally with the party?
Nearly 10% of Donald Trump's voters voted for Barack Obama. So there are people that voted for President Obama. And then they felt either, they wanted more economically, which I don't think they've gotten, a lot of those voters that voted for him. They felt left out. They were in rural areas, and they changed their votes, and I think we need to bring them back. But I don't think the two are exclusive. As you point out, when I've led our ticket in our state, every time I lead, I bring people with me. We flip the state house every single time I've led our ticket, 3 times in our state. Had the highest voter turnout in the country because we had such a fired up Democratic base, which includes our voters of color. But at the same time, I was able to bring with me suburban voters and people in rural areas, simply because I was willing to go everywhere, which I've done on this campaign. I visited all 10 counties in New Hampshire now 3 times. I have gone to small towns and medium-sized towns, and I've done the same in Iowa, and will do the same across the country. I think going not just where it is comfortable, but where it's uncomfortable is really, really important. And I also think that policies that are geared to bring people together. And I cannot stress enough to stop the mean tweets, remembering that what unites us is bigger than what divides us. And that's why I have stressed repeatedly that you've got to look at someone's record and what they've done to bring people with them.
Yeah. So on infrastructure, we've already touched on some of this stuff here, but you talked about broadband at the event today. We've written about your broadband plan, but in other realms, like for example, we're a very car-oriented society. When you're thinking of if you can finally get this big bipartisan coalition to vote on an infrastructure package, what does that look like long term with things, like considerations for the environment and how our society may be changing with artificial intelligence? How does that factor into what you think our infrastructure needs
With
to
automatic cars and
Yeah.
things, yeah. Okay. So my plan includes major investment in green infrastructure, and it will run side by side with the climate change plan. You're seeing the effects in New Hampshire, effects on your wildlife population. We have moose in Minnesota too, so we've seen that as well. Effects on rising sea levels, the oyster population off of Maine. We're seeing it in the wildfires in California and the flooding in the middle of the country. So any infrastructure package has to take account for that, and that means extra investment in things like water infrastructure and levees and locks and dams, and to have resilient infrastructure. But it also means looking at things like rail and making sure that we've got bike lanes and all those kinds of things as part of the infrastructure. But that is not going to be enough. That's short-term infrastructure. You also have to have climate change legislation, and of course that's the what I consider the easier things to do right away that a president can do without Congress. Getting back into the International Climate Change Agreement. Nicaragua and Syria were the only two countries not in it. When we got in, they are now in it. So we are the only ones. The clean power rules, and I have a lot of small electric co-ops in my state. And so I get those issues and how you can transition them at a different way than big companies. But they were ready to make those, the big companies, and then Trump dialed it back.
Yeah.
The gas mileage standards, which the big car companies were ready to meet, and he took that away. But the big ticket item is putting a price on carbon and then making sure, and that is going to be big money, conservative estimate $2 trillion that could come in, but you've got to make sure that money goes back out as dividends for people to help them afford their heat in our cold weather states, and to invest in jobs in areas that are going to have a transition away from certain kinds of energy. If you don't do that and have a really pretty much airtight plan that's going to create the incentives to go to carbon neutral, you're not going to get the votes to do it. And so I would combine, as you point out, the green infrastructure as part of infrastructure at the same time you're doing climate change.
And just how much local control, like for example, if you were going to set environmental standards for states to implement that funding, what if you have a state that doesn't believe that humans have a role in climate change and they don't want to roll that way? Would they not get the funding?
Well, that is, first of all, you're going to have federal policy. This is why what Trump did was so dangerous. You have federal policy when it comes to the gas mileage standard. You have federal policy when it comes to the clean power rules, and you set standards for each state. That's what those clean power rules is. And they have to find a way to meet them, yes, and there may be different ways and different glide paths, but they have to meet them. So it is federal policy.
Okay.
Yeah, and the different ways you can price carbon are cap and trade, which was passed in the House but not the Senate, or you can do a carbon fee. The economists believe that's most direct, or you can do a renewable electricity standard, like that's been pretty successful in our state. Tim Pawlenty was the first one that got that passed with the Democratic legislature in our state, and but you would do much more aggressively, and you would do it nationally. That's a way to price carbon. And you have different regional standards. So, no, this would be a national policy with money going back to dividends to consumers.
So you want
Otherwise, you're not going to get there. So.
you want to transition to renewable power, but it is a transition. It's going to take some time to ramp that up at any effective capacity. In the meantime, natural gas seems to be one of the
Transitional
key fuels. So what are your thoughts on pipeline projects? Jake mentioned local control, and right now there is none in terms of pipeline projects. If FERC says it can go through, it can go through.
Well, you have to have local input in these projects. I mean, that's part of what the whole issue is with the Keystone and some of the other ones with some of the landowners. So you have to have the ability of local approvals, and you do. So I think that's pretty important. I am not one of the people that says end all natural gas. I see it as a transitional fuel that was discussed, and I don't know if it's on the debate stage as much as that we had a series of climate town halls with CNN, and it was noted, that's where I was with a few others, and I do see it as a transitional fuel, and that it's an important part of reducing our greenhouse gases right now. So yes, you need pipelines right now, but you have to, in the end, create all these incentives to reduce the use of fossil fuels. And that's where you have to invest in an electric grid and in more vehicles that are either electric vehicles or depend on less fuel.
Do you think FERC has outlived its purpose? Would abolishing it be on the table, given
I
where we need to go?
haven't talked about doing that, no.
A lot of opponents of the Green New Deal think that agency could be the biggest problem in implementing a lot of that stuff. We were going to ask about climate change next, but that seems to cover a lot of it. So
Although one energy source that some people consider green and others don't is nuclear. What are your thoughts on that?
I believe that we have to find safe storage. And I am not one that said, oh, I'm against all nuclear. I mean, it is a vehicle and an important, if done right, it's a way you could get to carbon neutral. But we're going to have to continue to work on the storage if we're going to expand it in any way. So as a new president, in the first 100 days, I would review the nuclear plants that we have now and make an assessment on their safety with the agency. And then the other thing would be to look at what those safe storage alternatives are if we're going to do any kind of a expansion.
Do you have any thoughts on what to do with?
And right now
all
the
of that
market
fuel?
has made that expansion kind of hard, I think, after.
But the waste that
I think you've got
exists-
a step back. Like, I don't like Yucca Mountain and where it is and that idea of storage there. So you've got to step back, and I like
Yeah,
Yucca
a lot
Mountain. I don't
across
like
the
the
river
storage
from us.
there.
Yeah.
You've got.
Vermont, yeah.
We have storage right next to a tribal community, which is not a good thing.
Minnesota's a
and-
big state.
We have
Fit a
several
lot there.
nuclear. So it is but you have to be creative at looking at where it should be.
All right. I'm going to, speaking of transitions, move to some foreign policy
Okay.
topics. So the United States has a long history of interfering with other countries' business, sometimes militarily. Under what conditions would you, as president, authorize military action against another nation that was not defensive in nature?
Well, I think you have to look at each case, but it is all about our interests of our country. The president is the commander-in-chief. You have to keep our country safe, and you also have to stand up for our allies, which this president has not been very true to. I would not have removed those 150 troops from the border with Syria. I think what happened was predictable. Then you have the Turks come in and slaughter some Kurds who lost 11,000 people standing next to our soldiers. And so I think you have to look at the interests of our allies, ourselves, and you have to make smart decisions. Sometimes they're quick decisions, like responding to the sarin gas. That was one thing I agreed with the Trump administration that they did. But then other times, you've got to go to Congress and get an authorization of military force. I'm close friends of Tim Kaine, and I agree with the work that he has done. We should be going and getting a new authorization of military force for any involvement that we have beyond an immediate response to things that we need to do to protect America.
So are those interests always humanitarian, or can they be financial, or?
I think it depends on what is happening there. I'm, giving you some, I gave you the sarin gas example. I think there's I did agree with the initial invasion of Afghanistan after they sponsored terrorism. I would be bringing our troops home from there now. They've been there for over 18 years. I did not agree with the decision to invade Iraq. And I think that a president, you put troops on the line like that, you better have a good reason. And the one thing we didn't discuss is that you don't usually do this alone very effectively. You don't. Iranian agreement. For a long time, Iran has been the biggest threat to American foreign policy and security threat to our interests in the Mideast and our allies. And that agreement wasn't perfect, but we should renegotiate ourselves back into that agreement. A lot of what's happening was completely predictable, and we should not have gotten out of that agreement. Renegotiating with the Russians on the nuclear agreement that the president got out of, and at the same time starting the negotiations up for the New START treaty. I just think there are so many things we should be doing and getting ahead of things and working with our allies that this president doesn't do. Instead, he does, foreign policy by tweet at 4 a.m. in his bathrobe. And I laid out a coherent foreign policy, the 5 R's, which is about really reasserting American values and responding appropriately and renewing our leadership around the world and renegotiating these agreements, repairing our relationships with our allies. It can really be summed down to 1 R, return to sanity.
To be taking cases in the news today, you mentioned the Iran deal. We have, right now in Iraq, our embassy is being occupied, and a lot of analysts are arguing that this is in some ways kind of the boiling over of our maximal pressure campaign against Iran with these sanctions instead of sticking with the agreement. I mean, how would you handle that?
Well, like I said, I would renegotiate back into that agreement. We do have to remember Iran is a bad player. We saw it recently with Saudi Arabia. You saw it recently with some of these other terrorist attacks. And I think what we need to do is to start engaging with our allies. And that means our European allies, and that means other allies in the Mideast. So I just think what he has done has created such a mess. What we should be focused on is China and our economic needs vis-a-vis China and how we deal with China. And instead, because of what he did with that agreement, when the inspections were going on, when we had at least some certainty in terms of them not developing a nuclear weapon, when we could have maybe been focused more meaningfully on the two-state solution with the Israelis and Palestinians. Instead, there we are. And instead he lets the Turks invade Syria. And I just don't agree with how he's handled these things.
You mentioned trying to get reauthorization from Congress for war activity. And this is at least just kind of a broader question. Is there's certainly been a trend in recent administrations, certainly in the Trump administration, for a greater imbalance between executive authority and the legislative authority. Do you think the executive branch has gone too far, and when you're on the other side of the fence and you're in the executive branch, would you be dialing that back, or what would your philosophical approach on that be?
Yeah, so I would do things that are legal. And there's always, you can have disagreements on the law, I know that. But this unbridled executive power, this feeling that the president has that he can do whatever he wants, is wrong. As a judge said recently in America, the president is not king, the law is king. So my approach is this. First of all, we have to jumpstart trust back in our government. And you can do a bunch of things that are legal. I found 137 things you can do without Congress in my 100-day plan that are legal.
That sounds like an internet list.
Well, no, you should look at it. Rosa, she's right behind you.
We wrote about it.
No, read it. It's real. I've had a number of my political opponents, not Donald Trump, compliment me on this list. It is things like closing the boyfriend loophole so that domestic abusers, convicted domestic abusers, can't get AK-47. That's a bill I've been trying to pass forever. We found out that a president can do it without Congress. So that would be part of it. Then those big ticket items we need to get done, from climate change to infrastructure to doing something about prescription drug prices and healthcare premiums, obviously you're going to work with Congress. The first day I got elected, I would call the leaders of Congress to talk about these priorities. So you do it that way. But right now, what this president has done, it's worth looking at his turnover rate with the courts. It's unbelievable. Most presidents, including Bush and Reagan, have less than 25% of their things overturned, agency actions. And with this guy, it's well over 50%. I'm actually minimizing the difference of other presidents versus him, but they just have no regard for the law. So I would bring that back as a lawyer, as a former law enforcement person. I would bring that back. And that balance with Congress, which is so important, and the judiciary. But at the same time, there are things a president can do. A president can stop the policy of separating kids from their parents at the border. A president can get us back into the International Climate Change Agreement.
So let's talk about the border for a moment. And in terms of immigration, you support the DREAM Act. And a path towards citizenship. And that's, I think, what most of the candidates on the Democratic side would agree with, some variation of that for those immigrants who are here.
But very
But
few
then-
of them actually worked on it, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. But there there's also the question of people who would like to be here and what kind of standards we hold them to in order to get here. So do you think that I mean, obviously you don't want to be separating kids from their parents and putting them in cages at the border or making, people wait for months to adjudicate their
Asylum
claims.
cases.
But what kind of standard should there be for people who want entry to the U.S. and
Right.
do the laws that we have now,
I think
if
we
they
could-
were properly enforced, do they work, or do we need
I
to
think
change
we can
that?
make some of them better. I think that you want to have humane standards that are in keeping with human rights. You want to have legal standards, and you want to have some security at the border, but not this wall that makes no sense. But you want to have security at the border. I think you guys have commented on that before. So the way I would do it is comprehensive immigration reform. That brings the deficit down. Let's look at how we can pay for some of these things. By $158 billion in 10 years. That's why Grover Norquist supported it. Because people come out of the shadows. We have 12 million people here. They can apply for citizenship. Under the 2013 bill that passed the Senate with strong Republican support, not all of them, but you had a path to citizenship that took over 10 years. And you got to obey the law. Look at people's past and what they're doing now. You had to learn English, and there was a path to citizenship. And during that time, you could be a documented worker. That makes a lot of sense to me. Then there was also a cutoff date for if you came into the country at a certain point, then you couldn't apply for this path to citizenship. You could use some of that money to shore up security in those 3 Northern Triangle countries. You could allow people to apply for asylum. This is something the Trump administration went back on from those countries, so you have less of them trying to come through the border. And then, of course, you would have money you wouldn't lose, a lot of this money could go toward the deficit, but you could use a portion of it for processing asylum cases and the like. But the main thing to remember about this is that it's an economic imperative. Right now we have this shadow economy, and the reason the AFL-CIO supports immigration reform, as does the Chamber, is it's going to bring people out of the shadows and allow them to be more productive. They will pay taxes, they can start small businesses. And so I think it's the way to go. And we got to remember that 70 of our Fortune 500 companies are headed up by people from other countries. 25% of our U.S. Nobel laureates were born in other countries. It is one of the reasons that America's been so strong economically, the reason on the world stage, because we have people that are from everywhere in the world and are able to do business with people everywhere in the world.
So if you had to restrict immigration, I take it you don't agree with President Trump that we're full, but if, scientists have also talked about with climate change, we could see some pretty serious climate refugee
We already
issues.
seen that in Europe. That's what, it is some because of conflict, but even some of the conflicts are growing out of water issues. The subsistence farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. You're seeing a bunch of people that are coming up into Europe. And so it does get back to that base argument that we have to start doing things about climate change, or we're going to see more of this all around
Well,
the world.
just quickly, if you had that kind of situation on your hands, how would you think through that, and what kind of things would we do if we did have to, in some way, really restrict entry just on a logistical level?
It would be a combination of things like everything else. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Some of it is aid and humanitarian aid, working with the rest of the world. Some of it is helping people to be able to have their own economies. That's what a lot of the work done. It's Norman Borlaug, who studied at the University of Minnesota and was actually from Iowa, who came up with scientific ways with seeds to feed the world. Where right now we are not developing the kind of technology I think that we should, because we don't have the incentives in place. And so you're starting to see in Africa economies getting stronger and stronger. That's good, and we want to see more of that. So I think what you do, it's a combination of the work we're going to do in the U.S. on climate change by putting a price on carbon to develop those new technologies. That's the only way we're going to get to 2050 carbon neutral. And then selling those to the world, but also helping the world to do that. And then you also have humanitarian aid, and you also have, of course, some refugees and people moving. But it's not all going to be that. We have to think ahead of that.
Right. This is a topic I know you've talked about, which is our aging population. It's certainly an issue in New Hampshire. And you've spoken about your father and issues he's had aging. With a silver tsunami or graying America, or however you want to put it.
AARP told me it was too negative. I call it the silver surge. Yeah.
Programs that are targeted toward providing resources for seniors and health for seniors and resources for seniors would seem to be more important than ever.
Yeah, I think this is actually the big elephant in the room no one's talking about. And I think there's really some exciting opportunities. First of all, there's a lot of seniors that want to volunteer or actually work part-time, and we need workers. So we've got to think about that and where people are located. I know that's not what people usually start with, but when you have needs for the workforce, you have to think about that. What goes with that? Housing. A lot of this is creating, and Keene area has their own housing issues. I have a big housing policy that we brought out in LA. I think that's pretty exciting, but some of this would mean developing more senior housing so that you could have seniors then move into housing, and then they're closer to town or in town, and then that opens up some housing stock that could be rehabbed and things like that. Social Security, the big safety net program for seniors, keeping that strong. By 2034, it's going to be paying out 10 to 15% less. What I would do is lift the cap. It's at $133,000. Actually, this is Bernie's bill that I've been on from the beginning, and you could start it up at $250,000 in income again, and that would keep it solvent into perpetuity. Keeping Medicare strong, and now we get to my innovative ideas. Long-term care insurance, making that more available. I told the story today of my dad that got long-term care insurance somehow. I don't know who sold it to him, but it was smart. He got that. That's keeping him in this senior house with like 15 people that he likes a lot. He doesn't have that much in savings because of his 3 marriages, another story. And so I know exactly when his Medicaid kicks in, and so do a lot of other families, or they're going right to Medicaid. So making incentives in place to buy long-term care insurance and making it more affordable to get long-term care insurance would be a big part of this. How do we pay for that? This idea came up to me from someone in Boston who has a lot of money. A lot of wealthy people set up trust funds for their kids, and that's good. But if you take them a 500,000 and above, and you simply tax at the capital gains rate, which would be the personal or close to personal, the appreciation, not the whole thing, the appreciation on that every year, conservative estimate, it brings in over $100 billion.
If you do that, though, won't they?
Won't they move their money to
well,
something
yeah.
else? Well, then that's why you want comprehensive tax reform to when you do all of these things, including changing the capital gains rate to closer to personal. So there's a bunch of other things you have to do at the same time to get around that, yes.
We got a couple minutes.
But anyway, that would pay for the long-term care.
We talk about trade real quick. So it doesn't sometimes.
And then Alzheimer's, the fastest growing disease in America. 14 million people have it by 2050. Okay, trade.
No, yeah. I mean, yeah,
Not to be.
No, get out your stats while I can. No problem.
No,
It's
but
better
people
come with
don't
stats,
realize what a big we have
Yeah.
to have caregivers, and there's a reason to invest in the research.
You know, and it is a compliment.
The most expensive disease.
Yeah. So trade doesn't get a ton of love on the trail a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I am the one on the debate stage that said I supported with the changes, the labor, environmental, and the pharma change, the USMCA.
So-
Here's a little weird fact you don't know about me. I head up the U.S.-Canadian Interparliamentarian Group, which I didn't say on the debate stage because it would have taken the whole 45 seconds to say that. But I have long headed up the Senate group on Canada. I last went there, took Roy Blunt and Crapo right after Trump left, disaster in his wake after the G7. And we went up there then, and then I brought 15 senators over to the Canadian embassy to meet with the ambassador when Canada was basically out of the deal, to start negotiating back in with Portman and Toomey and a bunch of others, and Dick Durbin. And so we had a long meeting and an honest meeting to talk about that with the Canadians. And so actually that part of it I've worked on, and I said on the debate stage, Bernie and I had different views on that. Richard Trumka supporting this agreement. And Nancy Pelosi worked, and Sherrod Brown worked to negotiate this agreement. So I think you could take some of those new provisions and then of course apply them to new trade agreements that we may have, European trade agreements. Over 90% of our customers are potential customers are outside of our shores, and we want to make stuff, invent things, and sell them to the world. So that's where I stand. I voted for some agreements, but I have opposed some agreements because of some of the problems that were in the original USMCA.
So could you also just explain how the USMCA is different from NAFTA?
Sure.
I mean, some people have dubbed it NAFTA light and argued that it's not really.
That was even more before those agreements went in. So I think the new things that are in there. First of all, there's some changes for dairy, and as you know from being in New Hampshire and having Vermont next door, and what I've seen, I'm a senior member of the Ag Committee, negotiated 3 farm bills, that dairy has really suffered in this ag economy over the last decade, not just in the last few years. So there's some things with Canadian dairy and powdered milk and other things that will be really helpful. And so that's a difference. There's been some other changes that were made to the original NAFTA. That will be good. But these 3 new areas, probably the most significant. Well, one was getting rid of the Sweetheart Pharma deal for biologics. That was really good. Sort of locked in some pricing. But in addition to the environmental, the labor one actually allows for a tri-country group to oversee inspections of plants and workers in places like Mexico, which is a big stride, which is why Trump has supported it. And just if we could get this on an even field, and as we look at the big trade threat, which is China, we want to have a North America trading bloc and be able to work together in taking on China, and this will go a long way toward doing that versus not having any trade agreement.
So would you support TPP as it was negotiated before, or are there any tweaks you don't want to make to that?
No. What I would do there is look at negotiating again back into that agreement. And the way you do that is with these kinds of changes.
What were the shortcomings of TPP?
Farmer deal. There's a real sweetheart farmer deal in there, and I actually remain neutral on that as I was looking at it. But there was a sweetheart farmer deal in there, and then there was also the lack of the labor standards and some of the environmental standards. It's the same problems that were helped greatly by the negotiations with the USMCA. But I voted for the South Korean trade agreement, part because of the ag markets.
You mentioned China a couple of times, and one of the other things to be dealt with, I guess, from a United States standpoint, is their stance on intellectual property. What are your thoughts in terms of what we ought to be doing?
Yeah, they have been stealing our intellectual property for a long time, and I was involved in this way back of trying to, in our own country, do something when it came to on the web, when there was stealing of intellectual property. It was really hard to move on those things right back then. Remember the Pippa Sopa fight and all of this. These days are changing now. I think we're finally realizing that we have to do something about privacy on the internet, which is separate but related to some of these intellectual property issues. When they can just steal our plants, that's a privacy, plants layouts, that's a privacy issue for business. And then there's other privacy issues for consumers. So you would have to have this as part of trade agreements, and that would be one of the virtues of working with our allies, is pushing on standards for intellectual property and stealing of intellectual property, and what the international consequences are when international property is stolen, when intellectual property is stolen. And then the other piece about it, again, related domestically, is passing privacy legislation.
Would boycotting the Beijing Olympics be one of those consequences, potentially?
Everything is always on the table, but I think that what we really need to do is to start working with our allies to push China. And I would not do it in the way that the president has done this. One day he says $300 billion in tariffs, and then 2 weeks later he reduces it in half. China is in it for the long haul. And there's an old saying in trade negotiations, keep your promises and keep your threats. He doesn't do either. I have seen enforcement work even with China. I worked on this with the International Trade Commission when we had, and with the Obama administration when our iron ore mines were closing down. And we pushed it and pushed it. We got the President's Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, to go up to northern Minnesota, meet with the miners, meet with the mine owners, and he went back and they finally started to enforce those trade laws with counter-cyclical tariffs and with really going after the perpetrators. This was illegal what they were doing. They were dumping illegal steel on our shores, and now those mines are opened up again and some of them have expanded. So a lot of this is targeted trade enforcement, as well as figuring out, if you're going to use tariffs, what the consequences are when you do it.
I think you are up.
Yeah, well, I guess so. The last one. So what's if you had to pick one thing you would want to walk away from the presidency having accomplished, what would that be?
Well, I think on the policy front, it would be climate change, because I think that we can't just keep having our heads in the sand, that we're not leaving a planet to our kids and our grandkids, and after that, if we don't do that. But I think that the immediate American legal change would be democracy. And that means the tone of our politics and how we treat each other. But I also think it means actually doing something about making our democracy work, because it's getting harder and harder for people to speak out. And I'm making this as my last pitch in part because there's things we should be doing right now that Mitch McConnell's not letting go through. That is protecting our democracy from foreign powers. I lead the bill with James Langford, the Oklahoma conservative, to say to those 11 states, New Hampshire's not one of them, nor is my state, you're not going to get federal election funding anymore if you don't get backup paper ballots and you don't have audits of elections. And Russia knows exactly that the state of New Jersey doesn't have backup paper ballots, and which parts of other states, Louisiana, don't have it. They could wreak havoc on our elections. And that bill, which is co-sponsored by Richard Burr and Mark Warner and Lindsey Graham and Kamala Harris, that bill was headed to the floor. And Mitch McConnell stopped it. He made calls to Republican senators. That's why Joe Scarborough gave him that name, Moscow Mitch, that bill. It is, the White House made calls to stop that bill. That's outrageous. Social media companies. Your newspaper, when you run political ads in Keene, New Hampshire, you've got to look at those ads and figure out what are issue ads of federal legislative importance and keep them on file so political campaigns or reporters can see them. You also have to put a disclaimer on them, prepared and paid for by. That's the same of every radio station in our country and every TV station. Social media companies, 2 of which make over $1 trillion, they have no rules of the road. Yet it is predicted $3 to $4 billion is going to migrate over there for political ads. One of them isn't doing it. One of them's trying to do it themselves. A bunch of the platforms aren't doing anything. It's a disaster waiting to happen, and it already was a disaster. During the last election, an image of an African American woman's face, innocence, got put on African American Facebook pages in swing districts. It said, why wait in line to vote for Hillary with a fake Hillary logo? You can text your vote at 86153 or something like that.
Or the Pope endorsed Trump, and then a number of people believe
Okay,
that
all
to be
right.
true.
And if it's paid political ads, it's even worse. So there's a combination of remedies for this. John McCain did the Honest Ads Act with me when he died, and I miss him very much. Lindsey Graham took up that bill with me, but that thing is going nowhere. Right now, there's no rules of the road in place. Registering every kid to vote when they turn 18, passing a constitutional amendment to get rid of Citizens United. All these things are possible. We had a red district that a congresswoman won, a Democrat flipped the seat. She ran ads of people in rural areas standing on bales of hay trying to speak, and their lips were moving, but their voices were muted out. It was a libertarian ad, and it said big interests are trying to stop you from talking. I just think that if we miss this opportunity to improve our democracy, it's never going to be the same. And so there's a whole series of bills that are in that H.R. 1, 11, 12, 13 of them are mine, that was passed the House of Representatives that is sitting on McConnell's desk. And so that would be an incredible legacy to make it easier for people to vote and be part of our democracy.
So I just want to jump on because I did have this as a topic and we kind of moved past it.
Okay. I thought it was such a dramatic ending, but...
But your calling card in the race, at least in part, is bipartisan, can work across the aisle, get things done,
can
appeal
win
to
with
both
rural and
sides.
suburban voters. Yes.
So you mentioned Mitch McConnell stopping this legislation. If you were in the White House and he is still in charge of the Senate, how are you going to get done what you want to get done?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we have, when you see that we won in just recently in Kentucky and Louisiana and in the state legislative races in Virginia, that means something. This election is about an economic check. That's what we spent a lot of time talking about today. But it's also a values check. It's a patriotism check. It's a decency check. And there are voters like the guy I met in Conway, who was in a long line of people that had stickers on that said Supreme Court voter, climate change voter, reproductive rights voter. He had no sticker. I said, sir, you don't have on a sticker. He had a brown jacket. He said, that's because I was a Trump voter. And my neighbors, they don't know. So don't tell them, but I'm not voting for him again. We miss a lot if we screw this up by not understanding these independents and moderate Republicans who may not agree with us on every economic policy, but we must bring them with us instead of shutting them out if we want to make the changes we need to send him packing. So that's the first thing. Second, I have found ways to work with everyone, and I do it every single time, and even if he somehow stayed in there, I think you'd still have a much closer Senate. And there are a number of things that people have been waiting to get done. Immigration reform. I was in the group that Ted Kennedy put together when President Bush was president to work with him, and President Bush badly wanted to get that bill done. We failed because of right-wing talk radio. Then, when President Obama was in, we actually passed a bill in 2013, but it got stuck in John Boehner's freezer next to the frozen peas. But now this is the moment. I sat in those rooms, Tim Kaine and I did, with people like Mike Rounds and others that actually wanted to move on the Dreamer bill. We got a bipartisan agreement. They were ready to go. We would have gotten overwhelming support. We got gut punched by the administration on that. So I just think there's a bunch of things that the Senate knows we have to move on, that we need to get Donald Trump out of office to do.
Real quick,
So there's for every problem, there's a different route to success. But I believe those routes are there.
even in your own party though, like a Joe Manchin or a Kirsten Sinema, you don't think that you would work better with them than maybe a further left candidate would?
I think, I'll go back to what I said about Bernie and some of his positions. His problem is not always with me and just with me. His problem is with a bunch of people in our own party. So I think you want to have someone at the top of the ticket whose views are ones that at least most of the people in your party agree with, who's a fighter, a progressive, but a practical progressive, and who has a manner that works to bring people together. I also think you want to have someone who can actually bring others in with us, so we have a bigger tent and a wider coalition and longer coattails. And then finally, you want to have someone that can actually win and has that track record. In the state that knows me best, as more and more people get to know me, the Mason-Dixon poll from about a month and a half ago showed that I beat him in a state he almost won and has come back to nearly every year, and Mike Pence has as well, by 17 points. More than any other candidate, more with men than any of the male candidates for president. I've always done well with male voters and also women voters, but I think that is a unique position to be in as a candidate.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Well, very New Year's Eve.
Right? Well, it's so romantic, all of us. We should have some champagne or something.